Well, I've got a story for you today. The thief, dashing through fantasy lands going to steal a great diamond, and in the process pissing off a god. And if there's any god you do not want to piss off, it's one that is a giant spider whose followers believe that it tolerates other gods simply as its prey. So, with no further ado, I bring you today's story, Thagobrind the Jeweller, by Alfred Lord Dunsany. When Thagobrind the Jeweller heard the ominous cough, he turned at once upon that narrow way. A thief was he, of very high repute, and being patronized by the lofty and elect, for he stole nothing smaller than the moo-moo's egg, and in all his life stole only 4 kinds of stone, the ruby, the diamond, the emerald, and the sapphire, and, as jewellers go, his honesty was great. There was a merchant prince who had come to Thagobrind, and had offered his daughter's soul for the diamond that is larger than the human head, and was to be found on the lap of the spider idol Hlohlo, in his temple of Mongaling, for he had heard that Thagobrind was a thief to be trusted. Thagobrind oiled his body and slipped out of his shop, and went secretly through byways, and got as far as Snarp before anybody knew that he was out on business again, or missed his sword from its place under the counter. Thence he moved only by night, hiding by day and rubbing the edges of his sword, which he called Mouse, because it was swift and nimble. The jeweller had subtle methods of travelling. Nobody saw him cross the plains of Zid. Nobody saw him come to Mersk or Tlun. Oh, but he loved shadows. Once, the moon peeping out unexpectedly from a tempest had betrayed an ordinary jeweller. Not so did it undo Thagobrind. The watchman only saw a crouching shape that snarled and laughed. "'Tis but a hyena," they said. Once in the city of Ag, one of the guardians seized him, but Thagobrind was oiled and slipped from his hand. You scarcely heard his bare feet patter away. He knew that the merchant prince awaited his return, his little eyes open all night and glittering with greed. He knew how his daughter lay chained up and screaming night and day. Oh, Thagobrind knew. And had he not been out on business, he had almost allowed himself 1 or 2 little laughs. But business was business, and the diamond that he sought still lay on the lap of Hlohlo, where it had been for the last 2 million years, since Hlohlo created the world and gave unto it all things except that precious stone called Dead Man's Diamond. The jewel was often stolen, but it had a knack of coming back again to the lap of Hlohlo. Thagobrind knew this, but he was no common jeweller, and hoped to outwit Hlohlo, perceiving not the trend of ambition and lust, and that they are vanity. How nimbly he threaded his way through the pits of Snood, now like a botanist scrutinizing the ground, now like a dancer leaping from crumbling edges. It was quite dark when he went by the towers of Tor, where archers shoot ivory arrows at strangers lest any foreigner should alter their laws, which are bad, but not to be altered by mere aliens. At night, they shoot by the sound of the stranger's feet. Oh, Thagobrind, Thagobrind, was ever a jeweller like you? He dragged 2 stones behind him by long cords, and at these the archers shot. Tempting indeed was the snare that they set in Wath, the emeralds loose set in the city's gate. But Thagobrind discerned the golden cord that climbed the wall from each, and the weights that would topple upon him if he touched one, and so he left them, though he left them weeping, and at last came to Theth. There all men worship Hlohlo, though they are willing to believe in other gods, as missionaries attest. but only as creatures of the chase, for the hunting of Lohlo, who wears their halos, so these people say, on golden hooks along his hunting belt. And from Neth he came to the city of Mung, and the temple of Mungaling, and entered, and saw the spider idol, Lohlo, sitting there, with Dead Man's diamond glittering on his lap, and looking for all the world like a full moon, but a full moon seen by a lunatic who had slept too long in its rays. For there was in Dead Man's diamond a certain sinister look, and a boding of things to happen that are better not mentioned here. The face of the spider idol was lit by that fatal gem. There was no other light. In spite of his shocking limbs and that demoniac body, his face was serene and apparently unconscious. A little fear came into the mind of Thagobrind the jeweller, passing tremor no more. Business was business, and he hoped for the best. Thagobrind offered honey to Lohlo and prostrated himself before him. Oh, he was cunning. When the priests stole out of the darkness to lap up the honey, they were stretched senseless on the temple floor, for there was a drug in the honey that was offered to Lohlo. And Thagobrind the jeweller picked Dead Man's diamond up and put it on his shoulder and trudged away from the shrine. And Lohlo the spider idol said nothing at all, but he laughed softly as the jeweller shut the door. When the priests awoke out of the grip of the drug that was offered with the honey to Lohlo, they rushed to a little secret room with an outlet on the stars and cast a horoscope of the thief. Something that they saw in the horoscope seemed to satisfy the priests. It was not like Thagobrind to go back by the road by which he had come. No, he went by another road, even though it led to the narrow way, the night house and spider forest. The city of Mung went towering by behind him, balcony above balcony eclipsing half the stars as he trudged away with his diamond. Though, when a soft pittering as of velvet feet arose behind him, he refused to acknowledge that it might be what he feared. Yet the instincts of his trade told him that it is not well when any noise whatever follows a diamond by night, and this was one of the largest that had ever come to him in the way of business. When he came to the narrow way that leads to the spider forest, Dead Man's diamond feeling cold and heavy, and the velvety footfalls seeming fearfully close, the jeweller stopped and almost hesitated. He looked behind him. There was nothing there. He listened attentively. There was no sound now. Then he thought of the screams of the merchant prince's daughter, whose soul was the diamond's price, and smiled and went stoutly on. There watched him, apathetically, over the narrow way, that grim and dubious woman whose house is the night. Thagobrind, hearing no longer the sound of suspicious feet, felt easier now. He was all but come to the end of the narrow way, when the woman listlessly uttered that ominous cough. The cough was too full of meaning to be disregarded. Thagobrind turned round and saw at once what he feared. The spider idol had not stayed at home. The jeweller put his diamond gently upon the ground and drew his sword called Mouse. And then began that famous fight upon the narrow way, in which the grim old woman whose house was night seemed to take so little interest. To the spider idol you saw at once it was all a horrible joke. To the jeweller it was grim earnest. He fought and panted, and was pushed back slowly along the narrow way. But he wounded Lohlo all the while with terrible long gashes all over his deep soft body, till Mouse was slimy with blood. But at last the persistent laughter of Lohlo was too much for the jeweller's nerves, and, once more wounding his demoniac foe, He sank aghast and exhausted by the door of the house called Night, at the feet of the grim old woman, who, having uttered once that ominous cough, interfered no further with the course of events. And there carried Thagobrind the jeweller away those whose duty it was, to the house where the two men hang, and taking down from his hook the left hand one of the two, they put that venturous jeweller in his place, so that there fell on him the doom that he feared, as all men know, though it is so long since, and there abated somewhat the ire of the envious gods. And the only daughter of the merchant prince felt so little gratitude for this great deliverance that she took to respectability of a militant kind, and became aggressively dull, and called her home the English Riviera, and had platitudes worked in worsted upon her tea cosy, and in the end never died, but passed away at her residence. Well, that last sentence was an interesting turn, or was an interesting addenda. Story could rather have done without it, but reading through these tales one gets the sense that Alfred Lord Dunsany is rather partial to a twist in the tale. At the tail end, is partial to a twist in the tale at the tail end of the tale, even if it seems out of place for the mood and feeling of the story itself. But that was The Distressing Tale of Thagobrind the Jeweller by Alfred Lord Dunsany. And as always, I hope you, my dear, well, not readers, but listeners, a good night. And if you'd like some more stories from this author, I have a playlist right up on the screen here. Alternately, if you're looking for just one story from this same author, right over here.